At this point, we will remember the analogy of light that both Aristotle and St. Thomas used to describe this process of abstraction. It is as follows. Light is the agency that illuminates the color of an object. The eye is the agent that receives the color of an object. However, the color of an object is impossible to be known when there is no light illuminating the environment. When light is present, then the eye can receive the color of the object. However, if the eye is present and there is no light, the color cannot be seen. This is analogous to our topic because the species is like the color of the object. It cannot be known unless the agency of the human intellect is present. Just like color to the object, the species is still acting upon the object whether there is an intellect to observe it or not. And just like the eye with color, the intellect cannot know the object without the species of the object abstracting into the mind of the knower. James Kentz, a philosophy professor at St. Louis University, agrees with the analogy of light, and in his article states, "In a manner analogous to light illuminating a sensible object so that it can be seen, the agent intellect makes the nature of a material object actually intelligible so that it can be understood." In relation to this, we will take a look at an article that speaks on Aquinas' view on the perception of the senses. Ralph McInerney and John O'Callaghan wrote in this article that Thomas Aquinas claims that the change in a substance is a material and numerical change, while the change that happens when something is perceived is a change from potency into actuality. They use the example of color, similar to the analogy above, but establishing a different point. It plays out like this. When an object changes color, there is an actual change in the object itself, and the change can be numerical, or calculated. However, when a color is perceived, there is a change that happens in the mind of the knower that is an actual change. However, the mind is not changed into the color that is seen. Think of a hand that touches a warm surface. The hand will absorb the heat and become warm itself. However, the sensing of the warmth in the hand is something different entirely and is a change of the mind. If an inanimate object is touched to a warm surface, it will also change to be warm, but it does not have the accompanying change of sensing the heat. Therefore, when the eye perceives color, there is an actualization of the color in the mind that happens. The color which was once potential has now become actual. In this study of abstraction, we will be focusing on the second kind of change that happens, a change that accompanies perception. But this is the actualization of the object in the mind of the knower. Therefore, once the intellect has been exposed to the qualities and characteristics of the object, it is now in potency to know the object. The intellect engages or becomes active when it performs the action of abstraction. This process is when the intellect recognizes the species or the form of the object and draws it within itself. It takes the form of the object and gains not just the ability to remember it, but to recreate it. There is debate on what the process of abstraction really looks like. In fact, Gardel states in his account of St. Thomas's psychology that the species of an object, when taken into the intellect, is not necessarily a complete and exhaustive representation, but admits degrees of reproduction. This implies that the species is not simply being absorbed into the mind, but the opposite is taking place. The species or the form of the object is acting upon and informing our mind in just the same way that it is acting upon and informing the object. The act of knowing the object and the act of the object being known are one and the same thing. They are both part of the same species. Another element of experiencing the material world is that we as humans can only experience the world through the lens of human senses and understanding. And even further than this, each individual human only knows his own experience and can never know the pure experience of another. There is an article by Thomas Nagel written about the experience of being a bat. He questions whether it is really possible to know the experience of a bat. there are a few different levels of knowledge of a bat that help one to understand the experience of a bat. The first is knowing what a bat is, or knowing the physical attributes of a bat. It is a rodent-like creature with wings that is generally small in size. We know it has appendages that help it to hang upside down when it sleeps. It has fur and it eats bugs, fruit, and small animals. All of this knowledge will give indication of what the experience of a bat is like. However, we still don't know the experience itself. The next stage of knowledge is the interior conditions and characteristics of a bat. It is a nocturnal animal, so it is active at night. We know that it has the senses of touch and hearing, and we also know that their sight is bad, so they use a type of sonar to help them locate their food. It is known that bats have interior consciousnesses that can receive the data that the senses are collecting. This helps us to know a little more about the experience of a bat, but it still does not help us to know the experience itself. The third stage is hypothetical. Nagel entertains the idea of transferring one's own consciousness into the body of a bat so that they can truly experience what it is like to be a bat for themselves. They would be able to fly and feel what it is like to use sonar-like senses to find and eat bugs. This would be the closest to knowing the experience of bat. However, there is still an issue. A bat does not have a human consciousness with rational thought that is normally used to being in a human body. A real bat would not marvel at the fact that it can fly. It would just fly. In order to really achieve the experience of a bat, we would have to forget the fact that we were human, lose rationality, and then transfer our consciousness into the body of a bat. However, the issue with this is that there is no longer a human intellect involved, and the experience would not be known. Therefore, Nagel concludes that it is absolutely impossible to truly know any experience other than our own individual consciousness, and that even if we did succeed in transferring our consciousness, we would still receive that experience through the hermeneutic that it is not our own. This is helpful for our study because it helps us to realize that the experience of abstraction for one person is personal and distinct from every other process of abstraction that anyone else has. Once the process of abstraction or illumination takes place, the mind now gains the ability to express the species. This is known as the expressed intellectual species. As Leron Gordon, a philosophical author, expresses in his book, the act of illumination supplies the intellect with valuable information as to how to put together the puzzle of operations it understands into a unity of kind that results in a thing being one in kind, though made up of discontinuous parts. The species can be expressed through the means of recreation, as in building a table or chair after having seen one and abstracted the form of it. It can also be expressed by means of speech or language. One intellect can express to another the species of an object. However, if the receiving intellect does not have sufficient exposure to the actual object's qualities and characteristics, then the species will not adequately transfer. Instead, the description will be received and used later during the process of abstraction, when the other intellect receives more exposure to the object. This would be like when someone is trying to explain what a mug is used for to someone who had never seen one before. The receiving intellect will not be able to fully know the object without actually seeing one, or at least a picture of one. Once the species or form of the object is taken within the intellect, it also gives the intellect the ability for further reasoning. It can use the knowledge that it gained to gain more knowledge about the object itself or about other objects. The material world then becomes intertwined with knowledge, and the more that you learn gives you the ability to learn more. For instance, it is much easier to understand what a doghouse is when one knows what a dog is. If a dog is not known, then a doghouse will not make much sense either. And knowing both of these objects will help one to grasp the idea of a dog pound. Most of the time, philosophers are asking questions about things that are not necessarily subject to the material world. For instance, the topics of philosophy could have many locations at once, or not a location at all. Some examples are unity, love, evil, goodness, being, and non-being. Objects that are concrete and are subject to space and time, and there can only be one of that specific object in existence. Some examples are this chair or that mug. It is ironic, and actually the case, that St. Thomas's abstractions are very connected to the material world. In fact, Robert Pasnow states in his book on Aquinas, Thomas's objects of intellect are abstract only in their content. Their mode of existence is perfectly concrete, inasmuch as they exist as forms within the intellect. He is saying that the objects of intellect are concrete in the mind of the knower, and that the object is subject to space and time. The object is known by this specific mind at this specific time, and the abstraction of an object into my mind is distinct from the abstraction of the same object into another's mind. To conclude, let us do a recap of the process of abstraction. The world is full of many objects. Each exists as a combination of matter and form. Matter is what gives it its distinction from any other object and limits the object to space and time. The form, or species, informs the matter to be the way that it is and is what gives the matter characteristics. The human intellect, once exposed to the object, has the potency to receive the form of that object and becomes active when it does the process of abstraction. Abstraction is exactly that, receiving the form into the human intellect, and the intellect gains the ability to recreate or represent the object in any way. Also, when the human intellect receives the form of the object, it gains the ability to know more about the material world, particularly objects that relate to the object just received. We must remember, though, that Aquinas believes that what we know from abstraction is most likely the accidental form and not the substantial form. The process of illumination or abstraction is explained in much more depth by St. Thomas Aquinas, who uses the process for purposes of philosophy and theology. It is a process that can take place whether or not the human is aware of it, and it is extremely helpful to proceed in understanding the world to the point where we can understand how humans came to be and what we are made for.